I'm Daniel Minty, a cognitive behavioral therapist, teacher, and writer. We do the things we do because we want to. We want to act in kind or hostile ways. We want to feel gratitude or resentment. We want to love or to hate. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps us understand the cognitive and behavioral components of our wanting. Paradox is a word that comes to us from the Greek. Para translates as beyond, and dox as opinion. Paradox is that which is beyond opinion, beyond simple yes or no, true or false. Now, we are this thing. Paradox is the core of our existence. Hamlet says, to be or not to be, that is the question. The play named for the prince is an extended meditation on this question. And while we ourselves may or may not be considering suicide, in the course of any day, we consider hundreds of options from precisely Hamlet's position. So, while human beings always have opinions, human beingness is always before and beyond them. Human existence is, at the end and beginning of the day, paradoxical. We can set the stage for another human being's changing in two ways. One, we can offer a straightforward invitation. You are currently X. Might you prefer Y? We can, for instance, invite a patient, friend, or family member out of emotional suffering or self-defeating behavior and into a new way of being, feeling, and doing. The second way we can set the stage for this same change is by paradoxically inviting the person to remain in the status quo. My colleague Matt May and I recently taught a short class on this second approach. Matt likens paradoxical invitation to high-stakes poker, an image I like quite a lot. Moment to moment, our lives are this high-stakes event. Moment to moment, we can win or lose everything. As Hamlet sensed, win or lose our very lives. There are two flavors of invitation. One is the straightforward invitation. And I was thinking about work I've done recently and realized I probably offer that about half the time, maybe a little less than half the time. And it very much depends on the presenting problem. So we could talk a bit about what problems would lend themselves more to straightforward invitations and what problems would lend themselves to paradoxical invitations. But I do both. And with the straightforward invitation, someone says, I'm anxious, I'm having panic attacks or something. And I would say, well, would you like my help reducing your anxiety or reducing the panic attacks? And the person may say, sure, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that. And some of the time, that's all we need to do to set our agenda. We can go right into a method and succeed. We may want to linger a bit before we do that to hear if the person is in fact a candidate for making that change that they're asking us for help making. So, paradoxical invitation, I think of as setting the stage for the patient to invite themselves to change. And almost always with addiction work, and that can be substance use or gambling or shopping, something where the person's body and endocrine system and all that stuff's in the picture here. I would probably want to go with the paradoxical invitation. Also, with relationship conflict, where I have a sense that it's not just two pretty good eggs or trying to figure something out together, but there's a kind of addiction to blaming or anger or something like that. I would think of offering a paradoxical invitation to that patient when the time came to move on from the empathy phase of things into the invitation phase. So I think of a paradoxical invitation as setting the stage to see if the patient will invite themselves to change. And because we're setting the stage in that way, paradoxical invitations are diagnostic, because either the patient will invite themselves to change or they won't. And the only way we would get that information would be to set the stage to see which direction that they would plan to go. So we could view paradoxical invitation as a form of reframing, positively reframing some symptom or other. We could see elements of a paradoxical cost-benefit analysis, looking at the upside of some symptom and the downside or price the patient would pay to relinquish that symptom. And when we're delivering the paradoxical invitation, it's important that it be authentic. We have to believe what we're telling the patient, or they won't believe it. If we're being fake, they'll sniff that out immediately. So it needs to be real for us. It needs to be empathic. We need to acknowledge the emotion that's in the room when we're making the invitation. And I think it's really important to add stroking. So those would be the elements that would go into it. But at the same time, this is not a formula. If we're thinking of this as some script we can read, it will fall flat. It's in fact a conversation. And the conversation is going to be different with every patient every time we would issue the paradoxical invitation. So interestingly, this week, 2 consultation cases came up where we were experimenting with a paradoxical invitation. And to bring this down to earth, I'll just tell you about one of them. A colleague was asking for help responding to a patient who came in very angry and said that they had picked up a DUI on Friday night. And they explained that they were stopped by this cop who didn't know what she was doing. And they got written up, even though they know their limits. They've been drinking all of their life. They know when they've had too much. And that hadn't happened on Friday night. And they also know that they operate a motor vehicle very, very well, even when they have a blood alcohol count of some kind. So our colleague was kind of stuck without a response to that. So we thought, well, what if we offered them a paradoxical invitation that went something like this? Jim, it makes just complete sense to me that you'd be really pissed off right now that on Friday night, you'd been out drinking beers with your buddies. You'd stopped before you were dangerous, got into your car, you drove very well, didn't run any stop signs or red lights, and then you get pulled over by this person who actually you're paying. Your tax dollars pay this person. And this person knows less about field sobriety tests than you do. And you end up getting written up. So makes a lot of sense. You'd be pretty angry about that. And as I'm listening to realizing, you sound a lot more self-aware than me. Sometimes I'm out to dinner with friends and I'll have a drink or two. And then I start wondering, should I drive home? Is this a good idea for me to do or not? But it sounds like you don't have to wonder, you just know. And I think that's awesome that that's true for you. So I stopped then and checked in with our colleague who was channeling this patient. And I said, colleague, what happened for you? When I was inviting you to stay the course, be mad, declare your expertise, blame people who are incompetent or creating problems for you. Now you have to go to court, etc. And he said, well, it was interesting. At first, I thought, oh, this is great. Yeah, we both get it. And then when you started talking about yourself, I started remembering that I too have had that question at times. And if this were to continue as a therapy session, I would be saying to you, well, Daniel, yes, but. And I'd be inviting myself to look at my beliefs, my perceptions of myself, my choices, my behaviors, etc. So in any case, the patient will or will not yes but us. If they do, that opens one door. If they don't, it opens another. But that would be an example of how we could paradoxically invite the status quo and then just sit in a very open way and process whatever were to come to us as a result. So I will stop there. And what I'd like to do is give Matt the opportunity to add, delete, amend anything. And then we could open things up for questions and comments after he's had a chance to do that.
Hey, thanks, Daniel. I really liked your way of approaching this, identifying there's a difference between the straightforward invitation that we might use for anxiety or depression, things that pretty much nobody wants to have. Nobody wants to feel anxious. Nobody wants to feel depressed, versus things where there's a high degree of resistance, like a habit, addiction, or a relationship problem. Those categories, we need to use the paradoxical invitation step. I might just add a couple of things here quickly. One is I break down the paradoxical invitation step into a few different components, one of which is carrots, where I describe what are all the things that could be gained. What do we have to offer here? Whether it's more of a sense of control over some habit, what would be like, what do they have to gain from making some change here? And then a lot of the voice of resistance. I think I heard Daniel using some voice of resistance. Why that would be something they wouldn't want to change, whether they enjoy drinking alcohol or it's just not fair what happened to them, that their anger is quite justified and appropriate. But to really lean on, what are the things that are tempting or good about the status quo, and then to use open hands, to have an element of open hands, and the open hands sound a little bit differently in the straightforward versus the paradoxical invitation. The open hands and straightforward is something like, would you like my help with this anxiety and depression now? Or would you want some additional empathy first, and then we could always work on that later. Whereas in the paradoxical invitation step, the idea is more like, you probably are not wanting to change this or to my help with this problem, and I'm thinking we shouldn't include that as part of what our goals in therapy would be, the things that we would change. And there's more of an element of now or never, and we're taking the agenda away. And then we see if they reach for it. So it has a bit of an element where you feel like you're playing a high-stakes poker game. It can almost feel like a bluff. I agree with what Daniel is saying, that we have to be authentic. But I think there's also a little bit of a game being played here where maybe the authentic portion is that we're not going to try harder than them, and we're going to, and we are aware that they're not reaching for this thing that we have to give them, and so we're calling that out into the open in an honest way, that they're unlikely to want our help with this problem ever. And I think that more aggressive stepping away is sometimes what leads people to step a little bit forward there. I think it's one of the more challenging techniques. The idea is to create a strong contrast between all the benefits, the carrots that the individual has to gain, but also these powerful reasons they would not want to change, and then to let go. So that's my description of it, and I'll turn it back over to Daniel.
Thank you for watching this video. If you like what you've heard, you might consider subscribing to this channel. Though, of course, you might also consider not subscribing.